I'm going to walk you through the features and functions of loop follow. So we've got it right down here in our toolbar, and I am running on an iPad so that I can show you some of the functions on an iPad as well. This basically functions exactly the same as it does on an iPhone, other than you have the split window options. So coming in, you'll see right at the top we've got BG reading at the top with the trend arrow, the delta. 3 minutes ago is how long ago the reading came in. Underneath that, you have the loop status icon and the loop prediction. On the right, we've got an info table with all the standard stuff that you would see in Night Scout. We've got the graph underneath that with BG readings, a high-low line, basal at the bottom, and then insulin and carbs. And you will notice as it updates with each subsequent reading, these insulin and carb dots will show up on the BG line rather than just at the bottom. You can pinch to zoom on the graph, and Spike users will be familiar with dragging on the small graph to quickly go back to a specific point in time. Now I'm going to talk about the settings first. And if you see a slight stutter in the video, it's because I'm going to scroll down past my Night Scout URL and cut that out of the video. There you can see with the refresh, the insulin and the carbs both jumped right up onto the BG line for easier reading. At the very top, you have your Night Scout URL. When you enter that, make sure you enter https:// to start it. That is very important, as Night Scout now requires a secure connection. And then also do not put a trailing slash. And if you use tokens, you can fill in the token field. If you don't use tokens, leave that blank. Make sure this says leave blank if not using tokens. If you were to put a space in there, that can cause some issues. Now I'll just talk through the main settings. Color main BG text, that just gives you a nice simple changing it to all white or matching the green, yellow, red scheme. Force dark mode, you can see I'm running dark mode. It will follow your system settings. If you prefer to run not in dark mode, but you want the app to always run in dark mode, you can toggle this on. It does require a restart. I will just show you here what the graph and everything looks like when you're running not in dark mode. Persistent notification. This is similar to Xstrip's persistent notification. iPhone does it slightly different. You can't have one that just continually updates, but if you do toggle that on, it will give you a notification with every BG reading that'll just say the current reading. This is handy because you can show it directly on your lock screen. And I will show you one setting you should set if you do that. So if you scroll down in your iPhone settings to loop follow, you'll see you have the standard access. You want to make sure calendars is on, background refresh is on, but then under notifications, if you're using persistent notifications, you should disable banners. And what that'll do is that won't show the pop-up banner ever, but it will put the persistent notification both on your lock screen and if you want in your notification center. And then you should also set show previews to always. That way, if you just tap on your phone screen, your notification will be right there so you can see your BG reading directly on the phone screen. I will go back to the settings now. Keep screen active. This, if you have this turned on, anytime that loop follow is on screen, it'll disable your screen timeout. This is handy for nighttime mode when you're following your child overnight and you want to quickly be able to just roll over and see what the BG reading is without your phone screen turning off. It's also much safer because your iPhone will not terminate the app. So it's recommended to leave this on anytime overnight. Background refresh option will allow the app to refresh in the background as long as you don't swipe it close. So swiping close means to pull up and then swipe. As long as you just swipe away to the home screen, if that's turned on, it'll continue running in the background. It does this by starting a silent audio file that just loops indefinitely. And then the refresh minutes ties into that. If you're running a background refresh, you can tell it every 15-second interval how long you want it between refreshes. So if you experience excessive battery usage, this should, by turning this up and saying let's only refresh every 4 minutes, this should use less battery because all it's running is a timer for 4 minutes before it runs all the downloading tasks versus, for instance, a timer for half a minute. And then every time that timer hits, it tries to pull all the new data, the new BG, Basil, Bolus, etc. App badge, that is exactly what it sounds like. It sets the BG reading as the notification badge for the notifications on the iPhone, on the iPad. So current BG reading will always be shown right there on your screen without having to open the app. Speak BG was a requested feature. This will cause it to speak your BG reading out loud every 5 minutes. Some people have asked for this when they're exercising or things like that, when they don't want to look down at their phone, but it'll say it right in their ear every time they get an update. The system volume settings is pretty handy to force loop follow to override whatever your volume is set to. This will override do not disturb mode. This will override the vibrate mute switch on the side of the phone. This will override whatever your setting is in the volume slider so that you can force it to always play alerts at this specific volume. Now the graph settings, I'll just quickly mention these. Display it as dots or lines or both. I'll show you what that does, so lines and dots. The offset carbon bolus dots, what that does is that will either place these dots on the line or offsetting them places them stacked so that, for instance, at a time like this, you can more easily read them. The graph does automatically scale, and so if we look here, you'll see it automatically scales, and if you have them set to stacked, it'll add enough extra space above to scale to fit them in. But you can also set a minimum BG scale and a minimum basal scale. So for instance, if we set this at all the way at 400, now I'm going to force this to reload right now. Normally, it would just update that whenever the next BG reading comes. You'll see now it's 400 as a minimum scale. And then the basal scale works similarly. The handy thing with the basal scale, and let me just set this back to 250. With the basal scale, this can control how far up the basal renders behind your BG line. I have it set right now similarly to Night Scout, how it's about the same proportions, but if you want it, for instance, to fill the bulk of the back, we can just set this all the way to the minimum, and let me do an immediate force refresh as well. And you'll see now your basal chart is underlaid on the BG and everything else, so you get a nice full basal display. Just go ahead and set this back. The high and low lines just control where to place these lines on the graph. So you'll see it just moves these yellow and red lines up or down. That also adjusts which dots show up as red and yellow versus green. The watch settings, if you want to turn this on, this works just like Spike and Sugarmate, but I have added a few more features. You can see we've got the text down here. I list all the variables you can use in it. Now, if you want to use this, it's very important you create a specific calendar just for this. So I've already created a calendar called Loop. Got the default variables shown in here. And what these do is the system will replace the %BG% with the BG value. You can see on the second line I have C colon, so that's going to show a C colon with carbs for carbs, and then it'll replace the %COB% with the actual carbs on board. So you can add, like you could even say BG and it would list BG on your watch. Now, a few things I will do here. I'm going to add it right here and override because I want to see if there's an active override, and that will only display the percentage. The main display in loop follow displays the targets after it, but for the watch we don't have a lot of space. And then on the second line, I'm also going to put in loop status. So this is how you edit it. The minutes ago will only display if it's an old reading. And how it works is it continues updating that calendar event so that it's never going to just disappear. You will always be able to look down and see, okay, the last reading was 87 and it was 25 minutes ago. 30 minutes ago, 40 minutes ago. So you can always kind of know if you need to, give your kid a call or have them take something, even though you don't have any readings or finger stick. Now I'm going to switch over to the camera and show you what this looks like. So here you can see my watch. So we've got 175, flat arrow, -8 for the delta. It was, well, you can see at the top, it was 1 minute ago. The 10:21 is the time of the reading. It automatically sets it for 10-minute increments, just so it never disappears before the next one. But if it is an old reading, you'll see that 10:31 will just keep going forward in time, and then you'll get minutes ago. The 140 that's the current percentage override being run. And then carbs on board, insulin on board. Basal rate is currently 1.4, and then the loop status symbol that is currently looping. So we will go back to settings now. I'm going to toggle this off just because this is my iPad, not my phone. I have some debug settings in case you run into any issues or glitches, stutters. The first thing you want to try is you can toggle off whether the system will download basal, for instance, and graph basal. So if you turn off downloading, it automatically isn't going to graph also, but you can toggle these off to try and see which one might be causing issues. We've had things that we've encountered that we hadn't thought of, such as there was an insulin dose that was 10 years in the future, and that caused the whole graph to scale down to show this one dot that was 10 years in the future. So the first suggestion I have, if you encounter any weird glitches with stutters or lags or the graph not displaying correctly, is to turn every single one of these off, restart the app, give it some time and see if it fixes it, and then turn one on at a time. So first go try downloading and graphing basal and see if it's still working fine. Once you figure out, oh, it's the carbs, for instance, that's causing the issue, send us a message through the Facebook group and we'll try and figure out maybe what the problem is with that. I'll quickly show you the Night Scout tab next before getting into alarms. It's pretty straightforward. It shows full Night Scout. You've got Care Portal. So this is where we enter the calibration checks, pump site change, sensor start. Make sure you use sensor start, not sensor insert. We do run the Sage alert off of sensor start only because insert is really used for restarters. The first time they put the sensor in physically, and then every time they start the sensor session, you enter start. So we're basing it on the 10-day sensor start. Pump site change controls the cannula age, alert, and then the others down here for temporary overrides if you're using that with loop. It does have pull to refresh, so you just swipe down on the screen and it'll refresh your Night Scout app. Next, I'm going to show you alarms, and these are a lot. I'm going to talk about the standard ones first, and then we'll come back and talk about some of the other functions. So you've got the 4 standard alerts: urgent low, low, high, and urgent high. If I just turn on one, I'll show you the basics of how it works. When active is set on, that alarm will be triggered if it needs to be triggered. You've got BG settings, default snooze time, the sound, and you can just come and select any of the sounds down here below. And then if you want to pre-snooze an alarm, you can just tap here in the snoozed until, and I can say, okay, pre-snooze it for 1 hour, and you'll see is snooze turns on. When you click snooze in the app also, which I'll show in a little bit, this will auto set based on 5 minutes from whatever the current time is, and you can always disable a snooze by just unchecking it. Low is the same, and I'm going to hide these just so we don't get overwhelmed on the screen. So low is essentially the same, just a different BG alert level. High adds an extra feature. It's a persistence. So it requires, if you have this set, and you can set it to 0 essentially to make it not use this feature, but I have it set for 60 minutes. So this requires that the BG be over 180 for 60 minutes. And all it essentially does is it takes 60 minutes, which is 12 total BG readings every 5 minutes, and it looks back 12 readings in the past. And if that reading and the current reading are both over 180, it'll trigger the alert. So this doesn't require that every reading between those times is over 180, because if both of those start and end are, even if you're slightly dipping below it, it's probably a time when you want to trigger the alert. Urgent high will trigger, so if the reading is, even if the high hasn't triggered for persistence, urgent high can be triggered if it continues climbing and exceeds this value. Now I have fast drop and fast rise alerts, and these both work similar, just in different directions. So fast drop uses a delta, so this is if it's dropping by 10 or more per reading over the last 3 readings, it'll trigger the alarm. We can also use BG limits on this to only trigger it if it's below a certain BG, and the fast rise is only trigger it if it's above a BG. And this is important because with loop, I don't really care if she's fast dropping and 150, because I know loop's going to be able to handle that. But if she's fast dropping and 95, that's a time when I can proactively give maybe a little less carbs than I would have to if she's at 65. And so fast rise is the same, it's just the only difference is if it's rising and above the BG. Missed readings, this is fairly standard. Anytime the BG readings are older than 30 minutes or whatever value you want to set here. I have found that missed readings and not looping alerts can both fire right around the same time, because usually it's not looping if you have missed readings is what we find. But not looping will also trigger just even if you have readings, but the Riley link's not around. So you may want to play around with having one set to different times. So for instance, if you have missed readings, you are not looping. So potentially you want to set one lower time period than the other. And one important thing with not looping that I found handy was if it's overnight, for instance, and she rolls over and Riley link isn't connecting, well, if she's in a normal range, I don't really need to get woken up if she's not looping, because if it's just running scheduled basal and she's running a perfect 100 or 90, we don't have a need to trigger this alert. So you can set your values wherever you're comfortable with of don't trigger a not looping alert if your child is within a certain range. So this will only cause it to trigger, for instance, if it's below 90 and over 130 and not looping for 30 minutes. Miss Bolus is a new one. This is currently being tested because it's a lot to do with this. This is hoping to catch those times when your kid just forgets to bolus. They had entered carbs and, you know, saved without bolusing, or they were on the lower end and so it didn't recommend a bolus, or the bolus failed for whatever reason and they didn't notice it, which that's our typical time that we have. And so there's a lot of settings that I'll mention through here. Time is going to, so it's going to check for a carb entry, and then it's going to check if that carb entry is 15 minutes or older, and that's when the alert will trigger. It's also going to check for a pre-bolus. So this is how long before the carb entry should it look for a pre-bolus. So this will say if the carbs are right now, it'll look for a pre-bolus 20 minutes ago and allow that to count as the bolus to not trigger this alert. We can also ignore small boluses, so this is helpful for the automatic bolus branch. I don't want to consider a half a unit bolus as part of her missed bolus alert because that's going to be the AB branch running it. And then we can also ignore low treatments. So if you enter your low carbs, you're not typically going to put a bolus in for that. So for instance here, this would ignore any carbs that are less than 10 when she's under 70 BG. And so it will just completely ignore that. Now, I do have it set that if 20 minutes in the future, those were 10 carbs and her BGs are now 130 straight up, well, maybe we overtreated the low. And so that's a time when we would want this alert to fire. So this would come back and fire once the BG is over 70. Now this only looks back 1 hour in the past for carbs because the assumption is if it's an hour ago that the carbs were entered with no bolus, you're going to already be triggering your high alerts if you had the bolus that long ago. App inactive is going to attempt to fire an alert when if the app gets killed in the background by iOS. And usually the only time that's going to happen is if your phone was significantly low on memory and it just had to kill everything to kind of keep the phone running in general. This is a difficult one to test, so if you do encounter an issue where this fires, please let me know, because the only time this is going to fire is if iOS kills it automatically. Sensor change and pump change reminders. These are based on the 10 days and the 3 days for the pump change. This one is the only one that runs in hours, not in minutes. All the other alerts are in minutes. So for instance, with Dexcom change here, I can set this to 24 hours and give me a reminder at 8 hours for my snoozer. So what this would do is this will trigger the alert 24 hours before the sensor age reaches 10 days. And then when I click snooze, it'll keep it snoozed until 8 hours before the sensor change. So these are handy reminders to pop up because we regularly forget the exact time changes and things like that. Now those do require that, like I mentioned earlier, you use pump site change when you change your pump and CGM sensor start when you start your Dexcom session. Now, back here at the very top, the first thing at the top is a snooze all. If you're walking into a meeting, you need to snooze everything, you can just simply come pick a time. I'm going to snooze it until 12:30 today, and all alerts are snoozed until that time passes. If you want to turn the snooze off, and this works for all the alerts, to turn them off, just toggle the button and it clears out the snooze. The last one is a temporary alert. And we find this handy because times when like she might be stuck on high overnight and we open loop and dose a few units, we know at some point, and I had turned the alert on. So there you can see what happens when an alert comes on is I don't think you can hear the sound playing because it's playing in my headphones, but it flips to the snoozer screen, tells you the alert that's firing, shows you what the reading is, and when you click snooze, that will just disable it. For the temporary alert, it disables it. For the other alerts, it sets the snooze value. So I'm going to turn this back on, but make it not fire. When it's like overnight stuck on a high and you maybe open loop and dose a lot of insulin, you know you're going to need to close loop at some point. We typically, for us, it's 150. That's where we've just determined the magic number when we need to close loop and allow loop to cut basal and start catching up, but not have her drop low or keep going, jump right back high. So what you can do is open loop, do a manual bolus, set your temporary alert, and go back to sleep. And then this alert's going to fire as soon as the BG hits 150. You may have other alerts fire, like a fast drop if you have those settings set at that range, but this one is that very specific use case of I want to know when I need to go back and close loop, or she ate and I want to know when she ate when she was low, and I want to know when she hits 90 or 100 on the way up. You can cause this to fire automatically. Now, the only difference this does versus the other alerts is when you hit snooze, it just disables this. This is intended to be a one-time alert. If you want to kind of reset it, you can just turn it back on and set your new BG level. Now, the last thing I want to show, and this is iPad only, is the windowing mode. So if you've used iPad before, you know about split screen and things like that. I'm just going to pretend we're watching a Disney show. If you keep loop follow in your dock at the bottom, you can grab, and when you go over near the edge, just drop, and it'll go in split screen mode. Now, not all apps, like Disney on the left supports this. Not all apps support dropping another app to the left of them, but you'll see it works in 1/4, half, and 3/4 views. I will also show you slide over view, and that's if you just drop it without going to the edge. So this is slide over, and the handy thing with this is you swipe at the top, but then you can swipe it right back in at any time. So if you're handy watching a show and you need to check BG, you just swipe in and then swipe it away. So those are all the features and functions of loop follow. If you have questions, comments, drop them into a post in the loop follow app Facebook group. If you aren't part of that group, please, go submit a request to join it and use GitHub to enter any issues you have, any feature requests, things like that. GitHub.com/JohnFawcett/loopfollow, and then click on the Issues tab, and you can just type them in right there.